October 1944. A captured B-17 flying fortress sat on a German airfield, riddled with 127 bullet holes, one engine completely destroyed, hydraulics shattered, yet it had flown home. Luftwaffe command demanded answers. How did American bombers survive punishment that would obliterate any German aircraft? The solution was unprecedented. Let their best pilot fly it. What Hauptmann Ernst Weber discovered in that cockpit would shatter every assumption about American engineering and reveal why Germany was already losing the war. Fassberg Air Base, Lower Saxony, Germany, October 12, 1944, 08:47 hours. The morning fog clung to the runway as Hauptmann Ernst Weber approached the American bomber, his breath visible in the frigid autumn air. The temperature had dropped to 3 degrees Celsius overnight, and the smell of aviation fuel, mixed with the acrid scent of burned electrical wiring, still emanating from the crippled aircraft. Weber was 41 years old, a veteran of over 300 combat missions, born in Stuttgart, trained at the Luftwaffe's most prestigious fighter school. He had shot down 23 Allied aircraft. He understood aerial combat with a precision that bordered on mathematical certainty. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for what stood before him on the tarmac. The B-17G Lucky Lady had been forced down 3 days earlier after a bombing run over the synthetic oil facilities at Luna. German fighters had intercepted the formation, and this particular fortress had absorbed punishment that should have atomized it mid-air. Weber walked slowly around the aircraft, his engineering mind cataloguing the damage with growing disbelief. 127 separate impact points from 20mm cannon fire and 7.92mm machine gun rounds. The No. 2 engine, the inboard engine on the port wing, had been completely destroyed, its cowling blown away, internal components exposed like mechanical viscera. Hydraulic fluid had painted dark streaks down the fuselage. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese, with holes large enough to thrust his fist through. "It flew home like this," said Oberleutnant Dieter Schmidt, the intelligence officer who had supervised the aircraft's recovery. Schmidt was 36, a former aeronautical engineer from Munich who had been reassigned to military intelligence after losing his left hand in a factory accident. The American crew belly-landed in a field near Magdeburg. All 10 men walked away. Minor injuries only. Weber touched one of the holes in the fuselage, feeling the jagged aluminum edges. Impossible. The structural integrity should have failed, the aerodynamics alone. "Our calculations said the same thing," Schmidt interrupted, opening a leather folder containing technical assessments. "We've analyzed 17 captured B-17s over the past 18 months. The Americans are losing them, yes, but they're losing them at rates our pre-war projections said were impossible, given the defensive fire they face. On average, a B-17 absorbs 48 times more battle damage before catastrophic failure than a Heinkel He 111 or Junkers Ju 88. 48 times, Weber. That's not a marginal difference. That's a completely different engineering philosophy." Weber had been fighting American bombers since late 1942, when the 8th Air Force began daylight precision bombing raids over occupied Europe. He remembered the first time he had engaged a B-17 formation over the French coast. The massive 50 caliber machine guns, the tight defensive boxes, the way the bombers kept flying even when fighters ripped through them with cannon fire. The Luftwaffe High Command had initially dismissed the American bombers as poorly designed, too heavy, lacking the speed and maneuverability that German doctrine valued. But the statistics told a different story. By October 1944, American bomber production had reached incomprehensible levels. Boeing's Seattle plant alone was producing 16 B-17s per day. 16. The factory workers, many of them women recruited from farms and small towns across Washington state, were assembling the most complex aircraft in aviation history on a production line that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility in Michigan was producing B-24 Liberators at a rate of one every 63 minutes. The industrial capacity was suffocating, relentless, impossible to counter through attrition. Reichsmarschall Goering wants to understand how they do it, Schmidt continued, his voice dropping lower despite being alone with Weber on the empty tarmac. Speaking Goering's name carried weight now. The Reichsmarschall had promised in 1940 that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. American B-17's had been systematically destroying Berlin for months. The High Command believes if we understand their design principles, we can develop more effective attack strategies. Perhaps develop counter-tactics that target specific vulnerabilities. Weber knew this was desperation masquerading as rational analysis. By October 1944, Germany's situation was catastrophic. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. German oil production, the absolute lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, was being systematically destroyed by American precision bombing. The 8th Air Force was flying missions with over 1,000 bombers at a time, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters that could accompany them all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them, but orders were orders. Weber had been selected for this bizarre assignment because of his unique combination of combat experience and technical knowledge. Before the war, he had been an aeronautical engineer at Messerschmitt, working on the Bf-109 fighter program. He understood aircraft design at a fundamental level. He could fly anything with wings. And perhaps most importantly, he was pragmatic enough to accept unpleasant truths. "When do I fly it?" Weber asked. "Tomorrow morning, Aero 600 hours. We've repaired the minimal systems necessary. Landing gear, primary flight controls, one of the functional engines. You'll have a crew from the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin test facility. They've been studying the aircraft systems." Schmidt paused, his expression grim. "Weber, when you're up there, pay attention to everything. How it handles, how it responds to damage, why American crews trust it when nothing in our doctrine suggests they should." That evening, Weber studied the technical manual recovered from the crashed B-17. The documentation was extraordinary. 348 pages of detailed specifications, procedures, and emergency protocols, all written in clear, direct English that assumed the crew had received comprehensive training. The Americans trained their bomber crews for an entire year before sending them to combat. An entire year. The Luftwaffe was now sending pilots into combat with less than 20 hours of flight training, because fuel shortages made extended training impossible. The B-17's design philosophy was evident in every system: redundancy, robustness, survivability. 4 engines when 3 could theoretically suffice. Dual hydraulic systems. Multiple fuel tanks distributed throughout the wings with self-sealing capabilities that German engineers had dismissed as excessive weight. The defensive armament was almost absurd. 13 50-caliber machine guns covering every approach angle, giving the bomber the firepower of a light warship. But what struck Weber most was the oxygen system. American bomber crews flew at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and atmospheric pressure was insufficient to sustain consciousness. The B-17 had a sophisticated oxygen delivery system for all 10 crew members, with backup cylinders and emergency procedures. German bombers had oxygen systems too, but they were notoriously unreliable, and high-altitude missions were avoided when possible. The Americans didn't avoid anything. They flew in formation at high altitude in broad daylight, deliberately making themselves visible because their doctrine prioritized precision bombing accuracy over survivability. It was arrogant, it was wasteful of human life, it was tactically questionable. And it was working, because the aircraft could survive what would kill anything else in the sky. Weber walked back to his quarters through the darkness. passing the skeletal remains of damaged German fighters, awaiting repair parts that would never arrive because the factories producing them had been destroyed by the very bombers he would fly tomorrow. The irony was suffocating. He thought about the American crew that had flown Lucky Lady home on 3 engines with catastrophic damage, their training and discipline allowing them to execute emergency procedures that kept them alive. He thought about the workers in Seattle and Detroit, assembling these machines with precision that seemed almost inhuman in its efficiency. And for the first time in his career, Ernst Weber understood something that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. Germany wasn't losing the war because of tactical failures or operational mistakes. Germany was losing because American engineering philosophy, industrial capacity, and cultural determination had created a war machine that couldn't be defeated through conventional means. The B-17 wasn't just an airplane. It was the physical manifestation of American pragmatism, overbuilt, redundant, survivable, designed by people who refused to accept that casualties were inevitable. Tomorrow, he would fly it, and that understanding would become undeniable. Fassberg Air Base, October 13th, 1944. No 5:53 hours. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim blue lights marking the taxiway. Weber approached the B-17 wearing a captured American flight suit. The German crew had insisted he wear authentic equipment to properly understand the operational environment. The flight suit was warmer than Luftwaffe issue, made from heavy cotton with multiple pockets and reinforced knees. Even the clothing reflected a different design philosophy, comfort for extended missions rather than minimalist efficiency. The ground crew had worked through the night repairing essential systems. Engines 1, 3, and 4 were functional. Engine 2 remained a destroyed hulk, but the cowling had been secured to prevent drag. The hydraulics for landing gear and basic flight controls had been restored. The fuel tanks had been filled with precious aviation gasoline that Germany could barely afford to waste on what some officers had called flying the enemy's propaganda. Weber climbed through the waist gunner's hatch. The B-17 was entered from underneath, not through a forward door like German aircraft, and immediately felt disoriented by the cavernous interior. The fuselage was enormous, nearly 10 meters from nose-to-tail gunner's position, and surprisingly spacious. He moved forward through the radio operator's compartment, past the ball turret installation point, through the bomb bay walking on the narrow catwalk, and finally into the cockpit. The flight deck was revelation and intimidation in equal measure. The instrument panel was a wall of gauges, switches, and indicators that initially seemed chaotic, but resolved into logical organization once Weber studied the layout. Engine instruments clustered together, flight instruments centered, electrical systems to the right, radio equipment behind the co-pilot's position. Everything labeled in English with clear, no-nonsense terminology. Mixture, throttles, propeller RPM, cowl flaps, no ambiguity, no assumptions. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger would serve as co-pilot, a test pilot from Rechlin with over 2,000 hours of multi-engine experience. Kruger was 38 from Hamburg and had helped develop emergency procedures for the He-177 heavy bomber before that program collapsed into technical disasters. 2 engineers from Rechlin would occupy the navigators' and bombardiers' positions to monitor systems during flight. "The control column is enormous," Kruger observed, settling into the right seat. "Look at this. It must weigh 15 kilograms." Weber gripped the yoke, feeling its solid mass. "The hydraulic boost system is damaged, so we'll be flying with manual control. This will be physical." He tested the ailerons and elevator, feeling the resistance. The control cables ran through pulleys the thickness of his wrist. Nothing about this aircraft was delicate. The engine start procedure was elaborate. Each Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine required a specific sequence: mixture to idle cutoff, throttle cracked, energize ignition, engage starter, watch the propeller blades turn, mixture to auto-rich when engine fires. Weber started engine 1, feeling the entire airframe shudder as the 9-cylinder radial coughed to life. The sound was different from German engines, deeper, more guttural. American engines were not designed for efficiency or elegance. They were designed to run continuously for 8 to 10 hours at high altitude in sub-zero temperatures while absorbing battle damage. Engines 3 and 4 followed. With engine 2 destroyed, the aircraft would fly asymmetrically, requiring constant rudder trim compensation. Weber advanced the throttle slightly, feeling the aircraft strain against the brakes. The power was immense. Each engine produced 1,200 horsepower. With 3 engines running, the Fortress had more power than most German medium bombers at full capacity. "Tower, this is American heavy bomber. Request taxi clearance," Weber transmitted in German. The surrealism of speaking German while sitting in an American cockpit wasn't lost on him. "Cleared to taxi runway 27. Wind is 250 at 8 knots. Barometric pressure 1013 millibars." Weber released the brakes and the B-17 rolled forward, its tailwheel steering, responding to differential braking and rudder inputs. The visibility was extraordinary. The nose was nearly all glass, giving the pilots an unobstructed view forward and down. German bombers typically had restricted visibility due to structural framing. The Americans had clearly prioritized crew awareness over minor structural efficiency. They taxied past rows of damaged Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters, aircraft waiting for parts that would never arrive because the supply chains had been obliterated by the very bombers Weber was about to fly. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. At the runway threshold, Weber ran through the pre-takeoff checklist, an elaborate procedure occupying an entire page of the manual. Flaps set to 15 degrees, mixture auto-rich, propellers full forward. Throttles to 40 inches manifold pressure, intercoolers open. The detail was exhausting and reassuring simultaneously. American crews didn't improvise. They followed procedures developed through thousands of hours of testing. "We're attempting takeoff with a destroyed engine and battle damage that should make this aircraft unflyable," Kruger said quietly. "If this works, Weber, everything we've believed about bomber design is wrong." Weber advanced the throttles. The 3 functioning engines roared to full power, and the Fortress accelerated down the runway with ponderous determination. The aircraft was heavy, over 30,000 kilograms fully loaded, and even empty it weighed 20,000. Weber held the control column neutral, feeling the tail wheel lift off as speed increased. 80 kilometers per hour, 100, 130. The runway markers blurred past. At 160 kilometers per hour, Weber eased back on the column. The Fortress rotated smoothly, nose rising, and then they were airborne, climbing into the grey October morning. The asymmetric thrust from the dead number 2 engine created a strong yawing moment to the left, but the rudder had enough authority to compensate. Weber adjusted the rudder trim, reducing the physical force required to keep the aircraft flying straight. They climbed through 500 meters, 1,000, 1,500. The aircraft was stable, controllable, flying with 3 engines, and catastrophic battle damage that would have destroyed any German bomber within minutes. Weber leveled at 2,000 meters, reducing power to cruise settings, and felt the B-17 settle into steady flight. "Impossible," Kruger whispered. "We're flying a destroyed aircraft." Weber looked at the engine gauges. Oil pressure steady, cylinder head temperatures in normal range, fuel flow balanced. The Americans had designed this machine to absorb punishment and keep flying because they understood something fundamental. Crew survival was not secondary to mission performance. It was essential to mission performance. A bomber that brought its crew home could fly again tomorrow. A crew that survived could train replacements, share lessons, improve tactics. The German philosophy had been different. German bombers were designed for speed and payload efficiency. Survivability was addressed through tactical doctrine. Fly at night, use cloud cover, rely on fighter escorts. When escorts disappeared and night fighter defenses improved, German bombers became death traps. The He-177 heavy bomber program, Germany's answer to the B-17, had been a catastrophic failure, plagued by engine fires that crews called the flying lighter. Dozens of aircraft had been lost to mechanical failures rather than combat. Weber flew the B-17 through basic maneuvers, gentle turns, climbs and descents. The aircraft responded with predictable stability. It wasn't agile, this was not designed for dogfighting, but it was honest. The flight characteristics were straightforward, without the vicious quirks that made many German aircraft dangerous for inexperienced pilots. The Americans sent 20-year-old farm boys to fly these, Weber said, his voice carrying a tone of reluctant admiration. They train them for a year, give them an aircraft that can survive catastrophic damage, and send them to destroy our infrastructure in broad daylight, and we can't stop them. Not because we lack courage or skill, because they've industrialized survival. For 2 hours, they flew the damaged fortress over Lower Saxony, Weber pushing the aircraft through scenarios that would test its limits: single-engine approaches, emergency descents, maximum power climbs. The B-17 absorbed every challenge and kept flying. The engineers in back were documenting everything, taking notes that would be compiled into reports that would ultimately change nothing, because Germany no longer had the industrial capacity to redesign its bomber force, even if the knowledge could be applied. As they approached Fassberg for landing, Weber looked down at the patchwork of German territory below, a nation being systematically dismantled by the machines he now understood with terrible clarity. The B-17 was not just superior engineering, it was the manifestation of American cultural determination, the belief that problems could be solved through innovation and industrial might, that no challenge was insurmountable if enough resources and intelligence were applied. The landing gear extended with heavy hydraulic clunks. Weber configured for landing, flaps full, mixtures rich, propellers forward. The fortress descended on final approach, stable despite flying on 3 engines. The main wheels touched smoothly on the runway, and Weber applied brakes, bringing the aircraft to a rolling stop. In the sudden silence after engine shutdown, Weber sat motionless in the pilot's seat, his hands still on the control column. He had flown the enemy's greatest weapon and understood that the war was already lost, not because of this single aircraft, but because of what it represented. An industrial and philosophical approach to warfare that Germany had never understood and now could never counter. Luftwaffe Intelligence Headquarters, Berlin, October 18th, 1944, 14:30 hours. 5 days after his flight, Weber stood before a room of senior officers in a converted office building that had survived the most recent American bombing raid. The acrid smell of smoke still permeated the structure from fires burning 3 blocks away. The officers assembled represented what remained of the Luftwaffe's operational command. Men in their 40s and 50s, exhausted, cynical, desperately seeking any advantage that might slow the inevitable collapse. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland sat at the head of the table, arguably the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter pilot, with over 100 confirmed kills. Galland was 32 years old, prematurely aged by years of combat command, and he had been arguing for months that the Luftwaffe needed to fundamentally change tactics to address the American bomber threat. His reception had been hostile. The High Command preferred optimistic reports to uncomfortable truths. Weber's written report was 73 pages of technical analysis and operational assessment. He had spent 5 days documenting every aspect of the B-17's design, comparing it systematically to German equivalent systems, and drawing conclusions that he knew would be professionally dangerous. The report concluded that German bomber doctrine was fundamentally flawed and that the B-17 represented a superior engineering philosophy that Germany could not replicate given current industrial constraints. Hauptmann Weber, your report suggests the American bomber is essentially invulnerable, said Oberst Heinrich Bauer, commander of a fighter wing that had been fighting American formations for 18 months. Bauer was 46, from Bavaria, a career officer who had flown in the First World War. His wing had lost 63 pilots in the past 4 months. This contradicts operational reports. We shoot down B-17's every mission. With respect, Herr Oberst, we shoot down individual aircraft through overwhelming concentration of fire, Weber responded, standing at attention. The Americans accept these losses because the majority of their formations return home. Their strategic calculation is different from ours. They're not trying to minimize aircraft losses. They're trying to maximize target destruction while maintaining pilot survival rates that allow combat experience to accumulate. He gestured to charts he'd prepared, showing comparative loss rates. On average, American heavy bomber groups lose 3% of their aircraft per mission. This seems acceptable to us. 3% attrition should be unsustainable. But the Americans are producing bombers faster than we can destroy them. The 8th Air Force had 600 heavy bombers in January 1943. They now have over 2,000, despite losing more than 3,000 aircraft in combat during that period. They've tripled their operational strength while absorbing losses that would have annihilated any Luftwaffe bomber force. The room fell silent. The mathematics were irrefutable and humiliating. The B-17's survivability is not accidental, Weber continued. Every system is designed with redundancy. 4 engines when 3 would theoretically be sufficient, allowing the aircraft to fly home on 2 engines or even 1 in emergency circumstances. Dual hydraulic systems, self-sealing fuel tanks that we dismissed as excessive weight but which prevent fuel fires that kill crews. The defensive armament creates interlocking fields of fire that require our fighters to approach from disadvantageous angles. Galland lit a cigarette, studying the charts. What was most significant about flying it? The control forces, Herr Generalleutnant. The aircraft requires significant physical strength to fly with damaged systems, but it remains controllable. Our fighters and bombers become unflyable when certain systems are damaged. The control forces become too heavy, or the aircraft enters unstable flight regimes. The B-17 degrades gracefully. It becomes more difficult to fly, but not impossible. Weber advanced to the next chart, showing comparative crew survivability statistics. American bomber crews have a 47% chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions. 47%. This seems catastrophically low, until you consider that German bomber crews had an estimated 12% survival rate in 1943 when we were still conducting strategic bombing operations. The Americans lose more crews in absolute numbers, but percentage-wise, their crews are 4 times more likely to survive. This creates a strategic advantage we failed to anticipate, Galland said quietly. Their experienced crews survive to train replacements, refine tactics, and improve procedures. Our experienced crews die, and we send untrained replacements who die faster. An intelligence officer from the operations staff spoke up. We've been analyzing American training documents recovered from crashed aircraft. Their bomber crew training program is extraordinary. Pilots receive over 200 hours of flight training before being assigned to operational units. 200 hours, gentlemen. We're currently sending fighter pilots to combat with fewer than 20 hours because we lack fuel for training. The Americans have so much fuel they can afford to train their crews to expert levels before exposing them to combat. Weber remembered the captured American crew from Lucky Lady. The pilot had been 23 years old, from a small town in Iowa, the son of a farmer who had never seen an airplane until joining the Army Air Forces. The co-pilot was 21, from California, a college student who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They had flown the crippled B-17 home through a combination of training, discipline, and trust in their aircraft's design. They had followed emergency procedures from memory, compensated for failed systems, and made decisions under stress that kept their crew alive. The Americans approach aerial combat as an engineering problem, Weber concluded. They design aircraft that can absorb damage. They train crews extensively. They accept losses as statistically inevitable, but work systematically to minimize them. And most importantly, they have the industrial capacity to sustain this approach indefinitely. We are fighting an enemy whose strategic depth we fundamentally miscalculated. Bauer looked skeptical. So, your recommendation is what? Surrender because their bombers are well designed? My recommendation, Herr Oberst, is that we acknowledge reality. The B-17 is not invulnerable. But defeating B-17 formations requires concentrating enormous fighter resources at specific points, which leaves other areas vulnerable. The Americans understand this trade-off and exploit it. They fly multiple diversionary raids to split our fighter forces. They have long-range escort fighters that can accompany the bombers throughout the mission. They have radar navigation that allows bombing through cloud cover. Galland stubbed out his cigarette. The Reichsmarschall will not appreciate this assessment. The Reichsmarschall's appreciation is irrelevant to objective reality, Weber said, knowing he was crossing into dangerous territory. Germany cannot win a war of industrial attrition against an enemy that produces one heavy bomber every hour and trains crews for a full year before combat deployment. Our strategic choices are now limited to defensive operations aimed at minimizing damage rather than offensive operations aimed at victory. The room remained silent. What Weber was describing, what everyone in the room understood but rarely acknowledged, was that Germany was losing not through tactical failures, but through strategic miscalculations made years earlier. The decision to invade the Soviet Union while simultaneously fighting Britain. The failure to anticipate American industrial mobilization. The underestimation of how modern warfare would become a contest of production capacity and resource management. The B-17 was simply the most visible symbol of this miscalculation. A single aircraft that should not have been able to survive but did, because American engineers had designed it to survive, multiplied by 2,000. Escorted by fighters with fuel tanks, the German intelligence had initially believed were fake propaganda, flown by crews who were trained, disciplined, and increasingly experienced because their aircraft brought them home. Distribute Weber's report to group commanders, Galland ordered. Classification restricted. And Weber, you'll brief fighter wing commanders on B-17 vulnerabilities. Knowing how the aircraft survives might help us kill it more effectively. It's the only practical advantage we can extract from this knowledge. As the briefing concluded and officers filed out, Galland pulled Weber aside. You flew it. Honestly, could we build something comparable? Weber considered the question carefully. Technically, yes. We have engineers capable of designing equivalent systems, but we would need aluminum alloys we can't produce in sufficient quantities, machine tools that were destroyed in bombing raids, skilled factory workers who have been conscripted or killed, fuel for testing that we're rationing, and most importantly, time we don't have. The Americans started developing the B-17 in 1934. They had 7 years of peacetime development, refinement, and testing before the war began. We're trying to develop new aircraft while simultaneously fighting on 3 fronts with collapsing industrial infrastructure. Galland nodded slowly. So the answer is no. The answer is that wars are won before they begin, through decisions about industrial investment, strategic planning, and cultural priorities. The Americans decided in the 1930s that they would build survivable bombers capable of precision strategic bombing. We decided to build fighters and medium bombers for tactical support. Both approaches were logical given different strategic assumptions. Theirs proved correct. Ours did not. Weber walked out of the building into the afternoon gloom, passing bomb craters that were being filled by civilian conscript labor. The sky above Berlin was grey with smoke from fires still burning from the most recent raid. American B-17s had done this, flying in broad daylight, accepting losses but systematically destroying the infrastructure that sustained the German war machine. He thought about the pilots in those bombers, 22-year-olds from Iowa and California and Texas, farm boys and college students who had learned to fly the most complex aircraft in existence and were now dismantling Germany one mission at a time. They were not supermen. They were simply products of a system that had made different choices about how to fight a war, and those choices were now deciding history. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio, June 1947. The war had been over for 2 years, but its lessons were still being analyzed in the institution that had become the United States Air Force's primary research and development facility. The building housing the Aircraft Design Division was modern, constructed during the wartime expansion, and its offices were filled with engineers who had spent the war designing the weapons that won it. Ernst Weber sat in a conference room that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. He had spent 18 months in Allied custody as a prisoner of war, first in Britain, then transferred to the United States for technical debriefing. His engineering background and detailed knowledge of Luftwaffe operations made him valuable to American intelligence services, documenting German aviation technology. In early 1947, as part of Operation Paperclip, the program recruiting German scientists and engineers, Weber had been offered a position as a technical consultant for the Air Force. The irony was not lost on him. He was now working for the nation whose aircraft he had tried to shoot down, helping them understand the lessons both sides had learned. The meeting included senior Air Force officers and Boeing engineers who had designed the B-17. The purpose was to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the B-17 program's successes and failures to inform the development of the next generation of strategic bombers. Colonel James Harrison, who had commanded a B-17 group during the war and flown 37 missions, led the discussion. "Gentlemen, we lost over 4,700 B-17s in combat," Harrison began. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. "But we built 12,731 of them. The survival rate for B-17 crews was 46.3% for a full tour. Not good, but not catastrophic. German bomber crews had less than 15% survival rates during their strategic bombing campaign. The difference was survivability engineering." Michael Chen, a Boeing engineer who had worked on the B-17 program since 1938, nodded. The B-17's design philosophy came from a requirement specification that emphasized range, payload, and defensive armament. But the key insight was redundancy. We assumed systems would fail under combat stress, so we built backup systems, multiple fuel tanks, dual hydraulics, 4 engines providing 3-engine capability. The aircraft was over-engineered by conventional standards, which made it heavier, slower, and more expensive than theoretically necessary, added another engineer. "We received criticism during development that the B-17 was wasteful. Too much structure, too much weight devoted to survivability features. Those critics weren't flying combat missions over Germany," Harrison said bluntly. "The crews who flew B-17s trusted them. That trust translated into operational effectiveness. Crews that believe their aircraft will bring them home fly differently than crews expecting to die. They make better decisions under stress. They fight to save the aircraft rather than abandoning it prematurely." Weber had been asked to provide the German perspective. "When I flew the captured B-17 in 1944, what struck me most was not any single feature, but the comprehensive integration of survivability engineering. German aircraft were designed with survivability as a secondary concern. We relied on tactics and operational planning to minimize risk. The B-17 assumed risk was inevitable and designed the aircraft to endure it." He gestured to technical drawings on the wall, showing the B-17's structural layout. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, using a rubber compound that swelled when exposed to aviation fuel and sealed bullet holes. German fighters used similar technology, but our bombers did not. It was considered too heavy. The result was that B-17s rarely suffered catastrophic fuel fires, while German bombers burned frequently. American crews called fuel fires the quick death. For us, they were simply expected. "The difference in philosophy extended to crew training," Weber continued. "I reviewed American training programs after the war. Your bomber crews received over 250 hours of training before combat deployment. Pilots trained on the actual aircraft they would fly in combat. Crews trained together as units, building coordination and trust. By 1944, Germany was sending pilots to combat with fewer than 20 hours of flight time because we lacked fuel for training. The predictable result was higher loss rates and lower operational effectiveness. Jen pulled out statistical charts showing B-17 combat performance over time. Our loss rates decreased as the war progressed, even as German defenses theoretically improved. In 1943, we were losing 5 to 6% of aircraft per mission. By 1944, despite facing more fighters and heavier flak, losses dropped to 3%. The reason was accumulated experience. Crews that survived developed better tactics. They learned how to fly formation more effectively. They understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations. This was the strategic advantage we never fully articulated during the war, Harrison said. Every B-17 that brought its crew home contributed to institutional knowledge. Pilots who completed tours became instructors, training new crews with combat-tested procedures. Maintenance crews learned which components failed most frequently and developed preventive measures. The entire system improved continuously because survivability allowed experience to accumulate. The discussion continued for 3 hours, covering technical details of specific systems, operational lessons, and design trade-offs. The B-17 had not been perfect. Its defensive armament was eventually overwhelmed by German fighter tactics. It was vulnerable to frontal attacks, and its precision bombing was less accurate than pre-war theories suggested. But it had accomplished its strategic mission, destroying German industrial capacity through sustained daylight bombing while maintaining crew survival rates high enough to preserve institutional experience. Weber thought about the German bomber crews he had known, skilled pilots who died in aircraft that caught fire from single hits or became uncontrollable when hydraulic systems failed or couldn't maintain altitude on reduced engines. The Luftwaffe had excellent tactical bombers for supporting ground forces, but Germany had never developed a true strategic bomber comparable to the B-17, and by the time the need became apparent, it was too late. "What's the primary lesson for future aircraft design?" asked a young engineer from the Air Force's Development Planning Division. "Design for survival before designing for performance," Chen answered without hesitation. "Speed and payload are important, but they're meaningless if your aircraft can't bring its crew home." The B-17 proved that survivability engineering, redundant systems, robust structures, crew protection enables sustainable strategic operations. We accepted weight and cost penalties to achieve this. It was the correct trade-off. Harrison added, "The human element matters more than we initially understood. The best aircraft design is useless if crews don't trust it." The B-17 built trust through demonstrated survival capability. Crews knew that if they followed procedures and fought the aircraft, they had a realistic chance of getting home. That psychological factor translated into operational effectiveness that pure performance specifications could never achieve. As the meeting concluded, Weber walked through the Air Force Base, passing hangars containing the B-29 Superfortress bombers that had ended the Pacific War and now represented America's strategic bomber force. The B-29 had incorporated all the lessons of the B-17, survivability engineering, redundant systems, extensive crew protection, while adding pressurized crew compartments and even greater range. American aerospace engineering had not stopped with victory. It had continued advancing, applying lessons learned through combat experience. He visited the Air Force Museum's collection, where several preserved B-17s were displayed. One of them was Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete 25 combat missions. Weber stood before it, studying the aircraft that had become iconic symbol of American air power. The nose art, a pin-up girl painted on the fuselage, represented something uniquely American: the personalization of war machines, the injection of human identity into industrial warfare. German military culture would never have tolerated such frivolity, but perhaps that was the point. American crews didn't see their aircraft as impersonal tools. They named them, painted them, developed emotional connections to machines that kept them alive. This wasn't weakness or lack of discipline. It was recognition that human psychology mattered in combat effectiveness. A museum guide approached, noticing Weber's intense focus. "Did you fly in B-17s during the war?" "No," Weber answered honestly. "I flew against them. I'm German, former Luftwaffe pilot." The guide paused, processing this information, then nodded slowly. "What do you think of them now?" Weber considered the question carefully. "I think they represent something we failed to understand until too late. Not just engineering excellence, but a comprehensive approach to strategic warfare that integrated technology, training, industrial capacity, and cultural values into a system that could not be defeated through conventional means. The B-17 was not invincible, but it was survivable. And in modern warfare, survivability enables everything else. The men who flew them were heroes," the guide said. "Yes," Weber agreed, "but they were heroes enabled by engineers who understood that saving lives was not secondary to mission effectiveness. It was essential to it." That insight changed warfare. In the years that followed, Weber contributed to American aerospace development, particularly in survivability engineering for military aircraft. The lessons learned from the B-17 were incorporated into every subsequent generation of American bombers. The B-47, the B-52, the strategic aircraft that would define the Cold War era. Redundant systems became standard. Crew protection was prioritized. The philosophy that had emerged from the crucible of World War II became foundational doctrine. By the time Weber died in 1979, American aerospace engineering had achieved global dominance. The B-52 Stratofortress, incorporating every survivability lesson from the B-17, had been in service for over 20 years and would continue flying for decades more. American military aircraft were renowned for their ability to absorb damage and continue operating. The cultural commitment to bringing crews home had translated into tangible technological superiority. The B-17 Flying Fortress was retired from active service in the 1960s, but its legacy endured. Museums preserved dozens of the 12,000 aircraft produced, each one representing the transformation of American industrial capacity during the war. Veterans associations maintained the history, organizing reunions where elderly men who had once been 22-year-old farm boys flying through flak over Berlin could share memories of the aircraft that brought them home. Statistical studies conducted in the 1970s confirmed what Weber had understood in 1944. The B-17's survivability engineering had saved approximately 15,000 American lives over the course of the war. Aircraft that would have been lost with conventional design instead survived, bringing their crews home to fight another day. The cumulative effect of those saved lives, the missions they subsequently flew, the crews they trained, the institutional knowledge they preserved, had directly contributed to Allied victory. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness remained debated by historians, but the B-17's impact on aerospace engineering philosophy was undeniable. It proved that survivability could be engineered, that protecting human life was strategically valuable, and that cultural values about the worth of individual lives could be translated into concrete technological advantages. Ernst Weber's final published paper, written shortly before his death, analyzed the relationship between democratic values and engineering philosophy. He argued that the B-17's design reflected uniquely American beliefs about individual worth and institutional accountability. Democratic societies that valued citizen lives created incentives for developing protective technologies, Authoritarian societies that viewed individuals as expendable resources optimized for different metrics. The paper concluded, the Flying Fortress was more than an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of a nation's values, engineered into aluminum and steel, proving that the deepest competitive advantages in modern conflict emerge not from tactical brilliance or operational sophistication, but from cultural commitments to protecting those who serve. This lesson, learned at terrible cost during the Second World War, remains relevant to any society that must ask its citizens to face danger in defense of collective security. The B-17 had taught the world that wars are ultimately won by nations that invest in bringing their people home. The Flying Fortress changed warfare forever by proving survival could be engineered. What other untold stories from W22 reveal how technology, determination, and innovation shaped history? Subscribe to explore the hidden battles that decided the war and comment below, which aspect of W22 history should we uncover next? Your curiosity drives our next mission into the past.